I missed every Christmas for 18 years selling insurance to people who barely remembered my name, and last week I sat at my own dining table while my children argued over who deserved my house as if I was already gone. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice. I just sat there and listened, the same way I used to listen to strangers tell me no at their front doors, over and over again, until rejection felt like background noise. The house was quiet except for their voices, sharp and confident, like they had rehearsed this conversation before they walked in. My son leaned back in his chair, talking about square footage and resale value, my daughter scrolling through something on her phone, occasionally adding that the neighborhood had gone up at least 20% in the last 5 years. They spoke in numbers, not memories. Not one of them mentioned the years it took me to build this place. Not one of them mentioned the nights I slept in my car between appointments because I could not afford gas and a motel in the same week. I watched their faces and realized something that should have been obvious a long time ago. This was not sudden. Nothing about this was new. I had just been too busy to see it. I used to tell myself I was doing it for them. Every missed birthday, every Thanksgiving dinner eaten alone at a gas station off Route 75, every school play I listened to through a voicemail because I was sitting in a parking lot trying to close one more policy before midnight. One more signature meant groceries for the week. One more client meant the lights stayed on. That was the math I lived by. Simple. Necessary. American. I remember driving 200 miles in a single day, knocking on doors until my knuckles were dry and cracked, smiling at people who looked at me like I was interrupting their real lives. I learned how to keep talking when no one wanted to listen. I learned how to turn rejection into rent money. And somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing when my own children stopped waiting for me. They grew up in the space I kept leaving behind. I thought I would make it up to them later, when things got easier, when I finally had enough. But enough kept moving further away, like a horizon you never quite reach. And now here we were, sitting in the house I paid for, the house I missed my life to afford, listening to them decide what it was worth, not what it meant. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the walls, at the quiet evidence of everything I had traded for this moment. The truth settled in slowly, not like a shock, but like something heavy finally finding its place. I did not feel angry. I did not feel betrayed. I just understood. They were not fighting over me. They were fighting over what I left behind. And that was the first time I realized I had built a life they expected to inherit, not one they ever planned to share. I remember the exact morning everything started to shift, even though at the time it felt like nothing more than another ordinary day in a long line of ordinary days. It was early January, cold enough that the windshield had a thin layer of frost I had to scrape off with an old credit card. I sat in my car with the engine running, heater humming, coffee in a paper cup that had already gone lukewarm. My phone buzzed with reminders, follow-ups, leads that had gone cold weeks ago but still had to be chased because in my line of work you never assumed anything was truly over. Back then my daughter was 10 and my son was 12, and I had promised them I would be home early that night. I do not remember what the occasion was anymore, maybe a school event, maybe just a dinner they wanted me to be present for. I only remember the promise, clear and simple, like all the others I had made. I will be there. I always believed I meant it when I said it. I just did not always keep it. That day I drove nearly 180 miles across 3 counties, knocking on doors in neighborhoods that all started to look the same after a while. Small front yards, faded flags, mailboxes leaning slightly to one side. People opened their doors halfway, listened just long enough to say no, then closed them again with polite finality. I kept smiling. I kept talking. I kept moving. Around 5:30 in the evening I sat in a grocery store parking lot and listened to a voicemail from my daughter. Her voice was small, trying to sound cheerful, telling me it was okay if I could not make it, that they would eat without me. I replayed it twice, maybe 3 times, then I put the phone down and stared at the dashboard. I told myself I would finish one more appointment. Just one more. Because one more meant the electric bill would be covered that month. One more meant I was being responsible. I arrived home close to 9 that night. The house was quiet, lights on but dim, dishes already cleaned and stacked to dry. There was a plate left for me in the microwave, covered with a paper towel, the way I had taught them to do. I stood there for a moment, looking at that plate, feeling something I could not quite name back then. Not guilt exactly. Not regret. Just a quiet awareness that I had missed something I could not get back. I ate alone at the kitchen counter, standing up, because it felt easier than sitting at a table with empty chairs. That became a pattern I did not question. Days turned into months, months into years, and the rhythm of my life settled into something predictable. Drive. Knock. Smile. Sell. Repeat. I told myself I was building something stable, something lasting, something they would thank me for one day. I did not notice when their expectations changed, when they stopped asking if I would be there and simply assumed I would not. I did not notice when my absence became normal. Looking back now, I can see it clearly, like a trail of small decisions that led exactly where I am sitting today, at this table, listening to them measure my life in square feet and market value, as if that was all it had ever been. It did not happen all at once. Distance never does. It builds slowly, quietly, in the spaces where something used to be. A missed call. A shorter conversation. A visit that gets postponed and then forgotten. I remember the first time my son did not ask me if I was coming to his game. He just mentioned the score the next day, like I had already chosen not to be there. I nodded, told him I was proud, asked the usual questions, and then I went back to checking my schedule for the next appointment. At the time it felt efficient. Necessary. I told myself I was teaching them independence. I told myself they were strong because they had to be. What I did not realize was that they were also learning how to live without me. Years passed like that. Quiet adjustments. Subtle shifts. By the time they graduated high school, the rhythm between us had already changed. They did not wait for me to celebrate. They made their own plans. Their own traditions. I showed up when I could, late most of the time, still wearing the same blazer I used for work, still carrying the smell of car air freshener and cheap coffee. I would hug them, hand them a gift I picked up at the last minute, and tell myself it counted. That I was there, even if I had not been there the whole time. College made it easier for them. Distance became normal. Calls turned into quick updates. Text messages replaced conversations. When they needed something, they knew I would answer. Tuition. Rent. A little extra for books or groceries. I never said no. Not once. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like I was still doing my job as a mother, even if the shape of it had changed. When my son got married, I remember sitting in the second row, not the first. There was a reason, something about seating arrangements, something about keeping things balanced between families. I did not argue. I smiled, clapped at the right moments, told myself it did not matter where I sat as long as I was there. His wife was polite. Always polite. She asked questions about my work, nodded when I answered, but her eyes moved quickly, like she was already thinking about something else. I could not name it back then, but I felt it. A kind of distance that had nothing to do with geography. My daughter moved to another state a few years later. Said she needed a fresh start. I helped with the deposit on her apartment, helped furnish the place, even flew out once to help her settle in. We spent 2 days together, walking through stores, assembling furniture, laughing in a way that felt almost like before. Then I flew back home and went straight from the airport to a client meeting. That was the pattern. Moments of closeness, followed by long stretches of absence. I thought that was enough. I thought consistency in providing was the same as consistency in being present. Sitting at the table now, listening to them talk about the house like it was an investment, I can see the line that connects all those years. Every decision made sense at the time. Every choice felt responsible. But responsibility does not always look like love to the people waiting for you. And over time, I stopped being the person they waited for. I became the person they called when they needed something. And eventually, I became something even simpler. Something easier to define. The owner of a house. The holder of assets. A number on a page that could be divided, discussed, and claimed. The first time I heard them talk about the house like that was not at the dinner table. It was months earlier, quiet enough that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. My son had come by on a Sunday afternoon, said he wanted to check on a small leak under the kitchen sink. He moved through the house like he already knew where everything was, opening cabinets, glancing at corners, making small comments about how things could be updated. I stood a few steps behind him, watching the way his eyes moved, not lingering on anything personal, just measuring, evaluating. At one point, he asked how old the roof was. Not if I liked the house. Not if I felt comfortable there. Just how old the roof was. I answered without thinking, told him it had been replaced about 8 years ago, good for another 15 at least. He nodded, like he was filing the information away for later. His wife arrived not long after, carrying a coffee cup and that same polite smile she always wore. She walked through the living room slowly, running her fingers along the back of the couch, stopping near the window to look out at the yard. "It is a nice lot," she said, almost to herself. "Plenty of space. You could do a lot with this." I remember the way she said it. Not "you have done a lot with this." Not "this must mean something to you." Just what could be done. What could be changed. What could be turned into something else. I laughed it off at the time, made a small joke about not planning any major renovations at my age. She smiled, but did not laugh. Instead, she said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. "You should think about downsizing eventually. It is a lot to maintain on your own." The words were reasonable. Sensible even. That is what made them easy to ignore. I nodded, said I would consider it, and changed the subject. But that night, after they left, I walked through the house more slowly than usual. I noticed things I had not paid attention to in years. The small scratch on the hallway floor from when my daughter dragged a suitcase too quickly. The mark on the wall near the stairs where my son had once leaned his bike. The kitchen counter where I used to leave notes for them, reminders about dinner in the fridge, about homework, about when I would be home. Evidence of a life that had happened here, even if I had not been present for all of it. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom and tried to remember the last time anyone else had stepped inside just to talk. Not to fix something. Not to ask for something. Just to be there. I could not place it. That was when the thought first crossed my mind, quiet and unwelcome. Maybe they do not see this the way I do. Maybe this house is not a collection of years to them. Maybe it is just a property. A number. An opportunity. I pushed the thought aside, the same way I had pushed aside so many others over the years. There was always another call to make, another client to follow up with, another reason to stay focused on what needed to be done instead of what might be changing right in front of me. But once a thought like that takes root, it does not disappear. It waits. And it grows. And it finds its way back to you in moments like this, when you are sitting at your own table, listening to your children talk about your life as if it is already something they have the right to divide. The conversation at the table did not stop when I stayed silent. It continued, almost gaining confidence from the fact that I was not interrupting. My son leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table like he used to when he was a teenager asking for something he already believed he deserved. He started talking about practicality, about planning ahead, about how it would be easier if everything was clear now, instead of later. His voice was calm, measured, the same tone people use when they are trying to make something uncomfortable sound reasonable. My daughter nodded along, adding small details about taxes, about maintenance, about how properties like this should not just sit without a plan. They spoke like they were solving a problem, not like they were talking about my home. I noticed the way they avoided certain words. They did not say memories. They did not say family. They did not say mother. They said asset, property, investment. Words that make things easier to divide. Easier to discuss without feeling anything. I kept my hands folded in front of me, the same way I used to sit during client meetings when I needed to listen more than I spoke. Years of that kind of work teach you patience. They teach you how to hear what people are really saying, even when they are trying to soften it. What they were really saying was simple. They had already decided this house was no longer mine in the way I believed it was. It was something temporary. Something waiting to be transferred. My son eventually looked at me directly, as if remembering I was part of the conversation. He asked if I had thought about making things official. About putting everything in writing. His words were careful, but his eyes were not uncertain. He already knew what answer he expected. I met his gaze, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would wait by the window for my car to pull into the driveway. The one who used to run to the door even if I was hours late. That memory passed quickly, replaced by the man sitting across from me now, confident, composed, already planning a future that did not include me as anything more than a step in the process. I realized then that I had been thinking about this moment all wrong. I had been asking myself when things changed. But sitting there, listening to them, I understood something different. Nothing had changed suddenly. This was the result of years of small shifts, quiet expectations forming without being spoken out loud. I had spent so long making sure they never had to worry about stability that they had stopped seeing stability as something I created. It had become something they assumed would always be there, something they believed belonged to them by default. My daughter reached for her phone again, pulling up something she wanted to show, a listing in the same neighborhood, similar size, recently sold. She turned the screen toward me, pointing at the price like it was the most important detail in the room. I glanced at it, then back at her. She was not trying to hurt me. That was the part that settled in the deepest. There was no anger in her voice. No cruelty. Just certainty. That made it clearer than anything else could have. This was not a conflict to them. It was a discussion about something already decided. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let the silence stretch for a moment. Not long enough to make it uncomfortable. Just long enough for me to hear my own thoughts clearly. For the first time that evening, I was not thinking about what I had given up or what they were saying. I was thinking about something much simpler. Something I had not allowed myself to consider before. What I was going to do next. I did not answer them right away. I let the conversation settle into a quiet pause, the kind that usually makes people uncomfortable, but this time it did not seem to bother them at all. They had already said what they needed to say. They were waiting for confirmation, not discussion. I nodded once, slowly, as if I was considering their points carefully, the same way I used to nod in meetings when a client thought they had control of the conversation. It was a habit I never lost. Listening first. Speaking later. I told them I understood what they were saying. That planning ahead made sense. That it was important. To be practical. The words came easily, almost automatically, because they were not entirely untrue. Practicality had been the foundation of my life for decades. It was how I survived. It was how I built everything sitting around us. My son relaxed slightly when I said that, leaning back in his chair with a small nod, like we had reached an agreement. My daughter gave a quick smile, already moving on in her mind to the next step, whatever she believed that would be. I watched them for a moment longer, noticing how quickly relief replaced tension once they thought they were being heard. It reminded me of clients who signed papers without reading the fine print, confident they understood everything because the conversation had gone their way. I stood up from the table then, not abruptly, just enough to shift the energy in the room. I told them I needed a little time to think about the details, that I would speak with someone to make sure everything was handled properly. They both agreed immediately. Of course they did. It sounded responsible. Organized. Exactly what they expected from me. They gathered their things shortly after that, conversations softening into casual topics, weekend plans, work updates, small talk that filled the space where something more meaningful should have been. When they walked out the door, they did not look back. I stood there for a moment after it closed, listening to the quiet return to the house, a kind of silence that felt different now. Not empty, just clear. I walked slowly back to the kitchen and sat down again, this time alone, looking at the same table, the same walls, but seeing them without the weight I had been carrying before. For years I believed that everything I built was tied to them. That the house, the stability, the security, all of it existed for a single purpose. To be passed on. To be shared. To make up for the time I had missed. But sitting there, with the echoes of their voices still in my head, I realized something I had never allowed myself to fully accept. None of this was owed. Not to them. Not to anyone. I had earned every inch of this life the hard way. Mile by mile. Door by door. Rejection by rejection. And for the first time, I considered what it would mean to treat it that way. Not as something waiting to be given away, but as something that still belonged to me. The thought was unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, like stepping into a role I had not played in a long time. But it settled quickly, quietly, with a kind of clarity that did not need to be explained. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping on a name I had not called in years. A number connected to a conversation I had been avoiding, not because I did not know what needed to be done, but because I had not been ready to do it. Until now. I stared at the number for a long moment before pressing call, my thumb hovering just above the screen like I needed one last second to confirm what I already knew. When the line connected, the voice on the other end sounded older than I remembered, steady but slower, the kind of voice that came with years of experience and fewer unnecessary words. He greeted me by name without hesitation, which surprised me more than it should have. Some people remember details because it is their job. Others remember because they pay attention. He had always been both. I told him it had been a while, that I needed to review some things, that I wanted to make sure everything was in order. I did not explain why. I did not need to. He did not ask. Instead, he suggested a time the next morning, early enough that the day had not yet filled with other obligations. I agreed. After I hung up, I placed the phone on the table and let my hand rest there for a moment, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palm, grounding myself in something simple and real. That night I did not turn on the television. I did not check my messages. I walked through the house again, slower this time, not looking for memories, but for clarity. The living room, the hallway, the small details that had once felt like reminders of what I had missed now felt like evidence of what I had built. There is a difference between the two, but it took me years to understand it. The next morning I woke up before the alarm, the way I used to on days when I had important appointments. Some habits do not leave you, even when the reasons behind them change. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen counter, and watched the light come in through the window. It was quiet. Not lonely. Just quiet. I drove to his office a little before 9, parking in a spot that reminded me of all the places I had parked over the years, waiting, preparing, collecting my thoughts before walking into another conversation that could change something important. Inside, nothing had changed much. Same desk. Same folders neatly arranged. Same calm presence behind it all. He gestured for me to sit and asked how he could help. I told him I wanted to review my will, my assets, everything tied to the house. I spoke clearly, without hesitation, the way I had learned to speak when something mattered. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making a note, occasionally nodding, giving me the space to say exactly what I needed to say. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and asked a simple question. Are you looking to update, or are you looking to change direction? The words stayed in the air for a moment. Update meant small adjustments, minor corrections, staying on the same path. Change direction meant something else entirely. It meant stepping away from assumptions that had been building for years. It meant redefining what everything I owned was actually for. I met his eyes and answered without hesitation. Change direction. He nodded once, not surprised, just acknowledging the decision as something real and final. We began going through the details then, methodically, carefully, the same way I had built everything in my life. Piece by piece. Line by line. Not rushed. Not emotional. Just clear. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was not reacting to something. I was deciding. And that made all the difference. We went through everything in detail, not skipping a single line, not leaving anything open to interpretation. The house, the accounts, the policies I had spent years building, every piece of it laid out clearly in front of me for the first time in a way that felt different. Not overwhelming. Not heavy. Just precise. He explained each option carefully, what it meant, how it would be executed, what it would look like years from now when it actually mattered. I listened the same way I had learned to listen in my own work, not just to what was being said, but to what it meant in practice. For most of my life, decisions like this had always been framed around other people. What they needed. What they expected. What I believed I owed them. This time it was different. This time the question was simpler. What made sense for me? We discussed a living trust, how it would allow everything to be handled without confusion, without assumptions, without anyone needing to guess or argue over what I intended. He asked me who I wanted to include, how I wanted things structured, whether there were conditions or timelines I wanted to consider. Each question was direct, neutral, leaving the decision entirely in my hands. I did not rush my answers. I took my time, thinking through each one carefully, not from habit, but from clarity. I realized something as we moved through it all. I had spent years assuming that fairness meant equal, that providing meant giving the same, no matter the circumstances. But fairness is not always about division. Sometimes it is about intention, about understanding what something represents before deciding where it should go. When it came to the house, I paused longer than I had for anything else. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what it meant now. It was never just a structure. It was the result of choices, sacrifices, time that could not be returned. I told him I wanted it handled in a way that reflected that. Not simply transferred as an expectation, but assigned with purpose. He nodded, making notes, adjusting the structure to match what I described. We reviewed contingencies, possibilities, things that could change over time. Everything was accounted for. Everything was clear. When we finished, he printed the documents and placed them neatly in front of me. I read through them slowly, line by line, not because I doubted the process, but because I wanted to see it in its final form. This was not just paperwork. It was a decision I had avoided for years, now sitting in front of me, complete and defined. I signed where he indicated, each signature steady, each movement deliberate. There was no hesitation. When it was done, he gathered the documents, explained how they would be stored, how copies would be handled, what would happen next. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out of the office with a sense of quiet finality. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just certainty. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had that morning, the kind of sharp clarity that comes after something settles into place. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. For years, I had been reacting to everything around me, adjusting, adapting, doing what needed to be done without stopping to ask whether it still made sense. Now, for the first time in a long time, I had made a decision that did not come from pressure or expectation. It came from understanding. And that changed everything. I did not tell them right away. There was no reason to rush something they had already assumed was settled. Days passed, then a week, and life returned to its usual rhythm, quiet mornings, familiar routines, the steady pace I had known for years. But something was different now. Not in what I was doing, but in how I saw it. Every room in the house felt the same, but I no longer looked at it through the lens of what it would become for someone else. It was simply mine. That realization stayed with me, steady and constant, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear. My son called a few days later, casual at first, asking how I was doing, then gradually circling back to the same topic, careful but direct. He asked if I had thought more about what we discussed. I told him I had. He waited, expecting more. I did not offer it. There was a pause on the line, not long, just enough for him to realize the conversation was not going the way he expected. My daughter texted later that evening, a message that seemed light on the surface, but carried the same question underneath. "Just checking in," she wrote, followed by a comment about how important it was to plan ahead. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding immediately. I was not avoiding them. I was simply no longer reacting. When they came by the following weekend, it was almost predictable. The same table, the same chairs, the same unspoken expectation that we would pick up where we left off. This time, I spoke first. I told them I had met with someone, that everything had been reviewed and finalized. Their attention sharpened immediately, subtle but clear. My son leaned forward slightly, my daughter set her phone down, both waiting for details that they believed would confirm what they had already decided. I explained that everything was now structured properly, that there would be no confusion, no need for discussion later. I kept my voice even, measured, the same tone I had used in countless meetings over the years. They nodded as I spoke, following along, until I reached the part that mattered. I told them the house would not be handled the way they expected. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, just a simple statement placed exactly where it needed to be. For a moment, neither of them responded. Not because they did not understand, but because they had not considered the possibility. My son asked what I meant, his voice still controlled, but no longer certain. I explained it again, clearly, without elaboration. Everything had been decided with intention, not assumption. My daughter looked at me differently then, not upset, not angry, just uncertain in a way I had not seen before. It was the same uncertainty I had felt years ago when I first started, standing at doors, not knowing what would happen next. I recognized it immediately. The difference was, this time I was not the one waiting for an answer. I was the one who had already given it. The conversation that followed was shorter than I expected. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. They asked a few questions, careful, measured, trying to understand where the shift had happened. I answered what needed to be answered, nothing more. When they left that day, it felt similar to before, but not the same. There was no assumption in the air anymore. No quiet certainty about what would come next. Just a space that had been reset, defined in a way that did not require explanation. I stood in the doorway after they were gone, looking out at the driveway, then back into the house. For years, I believed I had built all of this for them. That everything I missed, everything I worked through, would eventually make sense because of what it provided. But standing there, in the quiet that followed, I understood something I had never allowed myself to say out loud. I did not build this life for someone else to claim. I built it so I would never have to depend on anyone to define it for me. And that was enough.